On this episode of China Unscripted, Xi Jinping says the U.S. is the biggest threat to China's development, how the Communist Party warps language to trick the West, and what will the Biden administration's China policy be? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
And big news, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, well, it's sort of a game of she said.
Okay.
She said the U.S. is the biggest threat to China.
Is that what she said?
That's what she said.
Okay. I feel like someone had to feed you the line, right?
I didn't realize I had to say it after.
Okay. Because if we hadn't fed you the line, it could have sounded like you were saying like a he said, she said situation.
Oh, I thought you were waiting for, that's what she said.
Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Chappell.
Matt will catch up.
Yeah, Matt will catch up. Yeah, the biggest threat. Now, what's interesting is, well, this was actually a point Matt made, so I'll let Matt say it.
Oh, well, I was saying earlier that if the U.S. were to do the same thing, in other words, if the U.S. president said China is the biggest threat facing the U.S., then the Chinese Communist Party would fly off the handle.
No word yet on what handle.
Yes. They really need to get a grip on it.
You would never hear the Biden administration say that something like that. They've been very much that, China may be a rival, but we need to cooperate.
Yeah,
together.
this is actually specifically what Xi Jinping supposedly said, which is the biggest
Listen
source...
to what she says.
Yes, okay. The biggest source of chaos in the present-day world is the United States. The United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and security. This is interestingly not like in a published speech by Xi Jinping. Basically, the New York Times found this in a speech published on a government website from a county official in northwest China. The county official was recounting what Xi Jinping had told them in like a private meeting of Communist Party officials.
Oh, so it is kind of like a game of he said, she said.
A little bit. Well, it's more like a game of Chinese whispers.
Like, are we allowed to say that?
I'm allowed to say that.
Okay.
You can say telephone.
It's like a game of telephone with Chinese people.
Yes.
It's like Huawei.
Ooh.
Oh, gosh. Well, no, that's when
right.
they're listening in on. That's like if you...
That's like a Chinese telescreen. You know telescreens from 1984?
Oh, okay.
It's the screen that watches you, right?
Really? Alexa, what's 1984?
Alexei?
Alexa. Alexa, mine's Russian.
Alexei is that guy who just got assassinated by the Russian government.
No, he
Well,
wasn't
no,
assassinated. He just got
alive.
poisoned.
He just got poisoned.
That's why in the script, and I thought this was funny, I didn't say it, but it was like he was poisoned and imprisoned,
Oh, that's true.
which I think is a little funny because, normally it might be the other way around, but usually
No, he was poisoned first
Mhm.
and then imprisoned.
in prison.
Maybe he was
He
like
was hung and then sent to jail.
It's a Rasputin situation.
Oh,
Oh yeah, he did survive poisoning, didn't he?
Yeah.
Rasputin,
and like
I mean.
getting his guts stabbed out.
Yeah. They eventually, I believe, just shot him.
I think they like tied him up, stabbed him or shot him and threw him in a river. And he died after successfully getting out of his bonds, but not quite being able to get to shore before drowning or succumbing to his wounds.
Wow, so he really was a witch.
Can men be witches?
If they identify
Later
as a
at
witch.
3 on China Unscripted.
We had lunch before this. It was a bad idea.
It was a great idea. We had Chinese dry pot. Oh, so good.
Okay, but I feel like we're
Off the
we're a
topic?
little handicapped now.
So we're talking about the game of telephone where a local official recounted what Xi Jinping had said, saying that the U.S. is the biggest threat to China's development.
Yeah, I mean, you're never gonna see Xinhua like publishing that Xi Jinping had said something like that or whatever.
In English or Chinese.
No, because it's a situation where obviously they want to kind of portray this whole, like what Xi Jinping said at Davos this year, right? Like, it's time for multilateralism, like shared prosperity, like for the global future. Like,
Cooperation, win-win.
Yeah, so there's no way that they are going to be like, well, they like to play the victim card, sure. Like, they like to say that, people are misunderstanding China or like accusing them of having concentration camps, like this is like all hurts the feelings of the Chinese people, but they're not going to come out and say, we're directly in like a Cold War with the United States, essentially.
Well, speaking of the concentration camps, this is a little bit of digression, but I want to talk about it because it's so crazy. The Uyghur women
Oh,
who have been speaking out like in interviews on BBC talking about, the concentration camps, the sexual abuse that happens, et cetera, et cetera. And then, what's his name? Wang Yibin, like comes out and like reveals personal information about these women. And there's like this campaign to be like, oh no, these women, they committed adultery. They're lazy. Don't listen. It's just so, like, it reveals so much about the character of these people.
There was actually an interview where Chinese state media went to interview the brother of one of the women.
Yeah.
And basically asked him, like, well, how come your sister is lying about all of these things? And he had to be like, well, I don't know. She just might be naive and misled. So there's this implication that maybe she's being told to say these things.
By who, Shelley? By who?
By foreign forces.
Imagine a powerful force telling an interviewee what to say. The way they told the brother what to say.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. I was like, you're making a point, but I'm not quite getting there. I got it now.
It's the dry pot.
Yes.
What's the excuse the other times? I'm sorry. Blame that on the dry pot.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's a fair criticism.
Well, okay. So let's go back to She Said. There, you were telling me, Shelley, about this other interesting thing that she was talking about struggle.
Oh, right. So this part was actually, publicized in Chinese state-run media that Xi Jinping had a special meeting with...
In Chinese or English, was it?
Both.
Both.
It's like he had a meeting with like these young Communist Party cadres, like...
Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Yeah, encouraging them to live up to the ideals of the Communist Party, serve the people, heart and soul. Like, you're a member of the Communist Party, so you have to be a good example, like this kind of stuff. All sounds great and positive in the English. And then if you read the Chinese version of his speech, which was published in Chinese by state-run media, he talks a lot about struggle, dozhen, which is not the kind of like, a struggle where like, you overcome things
Adversity
or
and
whatever.
hardship.
Yeah,
it's not Thomas the Tank Engine.
No. Does Thomas?
Sorry, that's different than the little engine.
Yeah, I was going to say the Thomas the Tank Engine. Close, but not quite.
So dojang in Chinese
means
what?
It's like a struggle, but in the sense of like fighting conflict, like
communist
class warfare, essentially.
Well, like,
right?
yeah, it's the kind of like you have two. It's the dialectic, right, where you have two sides that are in opposition, and then like they struggle against each other, right?
Yeah, and so in the Cultural Revolution, there were groups that you had to dojang against struggle. The party had to dojang the Tiananmen Square student protesters. The Communist Party had to dojang Fenggong.
Yeah, so this is like a very, common Communist Party term. And so he was talking about how these young Communist Party members must study the spirit of struggle, of dozhen, and they must keep up the struggle, all this stuff. He used the word dozhen like 48 times or something, like some like huge number of times in his speech, but like not in the English version. They took all that out when they reported on this.
Well, so yeah, that ties back to the original story about the U.S. being the biggest threat. These are the same things they're saying, just they don't really want to telecast it to the rest of the world.
I think it's interesting, too, because...
Alexei, thanks for sending me 1984.
Okay, well, let's tell a screen.
Oh,
but I'm sure Alexei told you the wrong word.
The cheap knockoff Russian version. I tell ya.
His telecast is just as good.
I mean, I don't get why people love this book, 1983.
Things were great in 1983.
Yeah, that's what the book doesn't go into. Speaking of dojang and struggle, 1984 is a good example of what what dojang means. Struggle.
2 minutes of hate and all that stuff.
Yeah, things like that. People should read 1984 more.
We could have a book club where we all read 1984 together. Doesn't that sound fun?
I was thinking about some kind of possibility of doing something like a a book club where we read books and we talk about it together or something.
I think
There was
the
an
book
idea.
club is the talking about it together. You have to read it on your own time.
I don't know. I mean, I think, Chris just reads 1984 out loud to all of us.
The year was 1983. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. My name is Ishmael.
This is like the Harry Potter fan fiction thing all over again.
Yeah, it's happening again.
Actually, it would be pretty hilarious to read knockoff versions of, I mean, I don't know if that exists the way that like knockoff Chinese DVDs exist. You know what I mean?
Oh, where it's like
Yeah.
they kind of have the gist of it.
Or like it's like Star Wars on the front, but
Schwarzenegger.
yes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Or
I'm
like the
cool with that for sure.
description is actually of Mission Impossible, but it's close.
Close enough.
I remember I was in Portugal in like maybe 1990, and I bought this New Kids on the Block tape. I'm like, oh, I've never seen this album. This looks so cool. And I buy it and I like put it in my Walkman. And it is definitely all different voices singing these random songs that I'd never heard of with some different languages mixed in. Like it was a very weird experience.
Okay,
I
now-
hope you kept that tape.
Gosh, I don't know what I did with it. I felt really betrayed by it. I was like, how could New Kids on the Block do this to me?
6-year-old Matt learns about counterfeiting.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I feel like that is an interesting story, but I feel it's overshadowed by the fact that 6-year-old Matt was buying New Kids on the Block albums.
Hey, I like New Kids on the Block. I'm not ashamed of that.
Good for you, Matt.
Yeah, there we go.
Isn't
Good for
there
you.
some reunion tour with them and the Backstreet Boys?
We
Yeah.
talked about this on the 2 podcasts ago.
Did we, or did we talk about it while we were setting up for it?
No. It was during the podcast because we were trying to make that tortured analogy about the WHO and the New Kids on the Backstreet Boys
yeah.
reunion tour. That's what
Yeah.
happened. And then we started talking about the New Kids on the Block.
Gotcha.
And I told you it was NKOTBSB, and you kind of were like, what is life?
Alexa, where can I buy the album?
In Portugal.
In 1990. Okay, all we need to do is invent a time machine.
Alexa, give me the time machine blueprints. Well, so the other interesting thing that she said,
Uh-huh.
going back to that, you were telling me about, it was something about being patriotic in Hong Kong.
Oh yeah, that wasn't a Xi Jinping thing though, specifically. That was like a Chinese state-run media
Yes,
thing.
what I said was that this was something Shelley told me. So I'm saying she told me.
Okay,
The story.
she said was me. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So can you tell me the thing that Shelley told you?
No, because I don't listen to Shelley.
But I'm constantly in your ear, Chris.
Yes, constantly.
Yes.
Constantly.
Okay, so the thing
Tell
is
Matt.
that the Chinese state-run media had been publishing. Well, I guess the backstory is that the Hong Kong Affairs Office, which is like the Chinese, like it's technically a mainland Chinese office that controls Hong Kong,
Mhm.
had made some statement about how any officials that serve Hong Kong that get elected must be patriotic to China.
Oh,
And
the oath, yeah.
yeah, so like that was basically interpreted as they're going to start disqualifying pro-democracy district councilors, which is like, like a town council or like, think of like the lowest level of,
Yeah.
like, people who deal with garbage pickup and stuff like that normally.
They have very little power, but it's the only branch of the government that's always been completely
Elected, yeah.
completely elected. And technically, the district councilors have the ability to elect 117 seats on the 1,200 person seat that elects the chief executive.
If you're thinking that Hong Kong government sounds complicated, you would be right. But,
No, it's the
yeah.
party. It's in charge. Easy.
Okay, that part's easy, but the technicalities of how they manage to jury rig everything is
Yeah.
kind of complicated. But the point is, district council used to not be that important. Mostly was controlled by pro-Beijing politicians. And then in 2019, during the protests, because that was the only election people could vote in, like people voted in like almost every district except one was voted in like the pro-democracy people. So now basically they're going to try to disqualify them. And then of course, after they made this announcement about, having to be patriotic and stuff like that, there was some backlash, from Western governments, foreign media. And so China Daily took it upon themselves to defend this by pointing that every other country talks about patriotism.
Yep.
When Barack Obama was president, he talked about how important it was to be patriotic. What's wrong with wanting Hong Kong officials to be patriotic too? It's completely the same
It
thing.
makes so much sense.
Yeah,
It's so
I'm
rational.
also completely fooled by that logic.
So it was like this full page color thing where you scroll through and then there's quotes from UK officials and all these. It's basically trying to accuse the West of hypocrisy, right?
Mhm.
How come you can be patriotic and we can't tell our people to be patriotic?
Yes, it's amazing how they really. Who does that fool though? Who is the audience of that?
Well, I mean, I think if you're not really thinking about it critically, you're not seeing how they're twisting and warping language to suit their own political ends. So they take a word that everyone agrees is good and they change it to mean one thing for them while other people still mean a different thing. So it's the same way they handle the term human rights, is everyone universally agrees that human rights are good. And therefore, what the Communist Party does is they redefine human rights as giving people economic opportunity,
Lifting people out of
poverty. And so now China can say, oh, look how many people we have lifted out of poverty. China has the best human rights. And they're just using the same term, but using a totally different definition for it. And I think that does actually fool a lot of people. And some people who aren't thinking deeply about the implications of it are like, oh, well, okay, it makes sense that economics could also be a human right. That's just how they look at it. But what they're not seeing is that the deeper meaning behind it is that we, the Communist Party, are not going to give you the other human rights. We're actually using this to replace the values that you hold.
It's actually superior to the values that you hold, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for the Hong Kong thing, coming back to that, it's like China's Communist Party takes the word patriotism, which is loving your country and doing things for the sake of your country, and they're redefining that as acting in a way that is obedient to the Communist Party rather than it being a love for the actual future of the country and the people. And so, but no one's saying this, right? Then no one's explaining how they're warping the language. It's just that they're using the same term. And so now they're like, oh, well, Hong Kong should be patriotic because the UK says UK citizens should be patriotic and America says American citizens should be patriotic. And it all comes down to this way that the Communist Party changes language to trick people and push its own repressive agenda.
Can I just say that I'm very impressed? Maybe we should have dry pot more often before a podcast.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, that was very well explained.
Well,
I think that's
again,
the first nice thing you said to me on a podcast.
Hey, that's not true.
Might be. But again, who is the audience of that? Who's actually being fooled by it? Because you say people who aren't thinking critically. People who aren't thinking critically are not seeking out what the Hong Kong Foreign Affairs liaison
or the
is saying.
But it gets filtered through things, right? The Hong Kong Macau office guy says this gets repeated by Chinese state-run media. People who
so when I ask Lexi which country has the best human rights, I get China as the answer. Now I get it.
Well, kind of. Then there are the people who will carry water for the CCP, right? I was watching this guy, Victor Gao, who is a erudite Chinese-British guy, speaks with a British accent, who is basically...
He must be smart.
He's basically a mouthpiece for the CCP, even though he's not officially a mouthpiece for the CCP. But he's being interviewed on BBC about the Uyghur concentration camps, right?
The vocational training centers.
The vocational training. And he goes off on this rant about how it's unfair if people should be treating China fairly and all this stuff. And then I watched a couple other appearances he made on Al Jazeera and this kind of stuff, and he was pulling this act with the word terrorism or fighting terrorism. The Al Jazeera reporter was basically being do you support torture that's happening in these camps and all this stuff? And he read out some of the things that the survivors of the camps were saying like they had their fingernails pulled out and like electrocution from like cattle prods and all this stuff. And then Victor Gao kept like taking it back to, well, this is about fighting terrorism. I support fighting terrorism. Like he was avoiding the accusations of torture by justifying the program as a whole, like as like this is China fighting terrorism, and we have more than 50 countries around the world who have sent letters of support for China fighting terrorism.
And those countries are
like Zimbabwe, So
yeah.
It's just like he can hide behind this term of like fighting terrorism that the CCP has redefined as like, well, to fight terrorism, what you have to do is actually just like brainwash an entire people.
Yeah. Well, I guess it is like, the big lie. You tell a lie long enough, people will believe it. So even though it is like so transparently stupid to anyone with half a brain, it just gets repeated.
And then it gets filtered through these different, ways of talking about it, different people saying these things. And then, you get like media that's like Gray Zone or something, where they're like, well, we're against American imperialism. So like everything that China says is right. And like, the concentration camps are a lie. Like there's different, like you hear it from different parts of society, and then it becomes, like, oh, well, let's be reasonable. Like people have different perspectives on cultural differences about human rights. Like that's
cultural norms.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a part of this in saying that like, oh, well, if people just like aren't paying attention, or, there's so many issues going on in the world that like, most people, like most Americans, are not paying attention to China issues at all, or if so, only very tangentially, right? And so like you can't expect the average person to hear what the Chinese Communist Party says about Hong Kong patriotism and then analyze it.
But they're not going to hear it.
Well, yeah, but what happens? So that's the next point, right? Which is that then when things get filtered through the media, then that's when people hear about it, right? They're not hearing about it directly.
I mean, this guy was talking about the stuff on the BBC about, the concentration camps.
People watch BBC, they watch Al Jazeera, they read the New York Times. The media organizations, media have an outsized influence on how people think about issues, right? Because typically the first time you hear about some international issue is going to be through television or newspaper or the digital equivalent. And so media has this enormous effect on how people think about the world. Even like one journalist not being clued in on, what it means, or not taking the time to add context or analysis can actually have a huge impact on how a large number of people think about a particular issue, right? If, for example, if media report on persecution of Uyghurs in a certain way, that's going to affect. I mean, that issue, I think, is that cat's already out of the bag, right? But there's other smaller issues that don't get a whole lot of attention, such as the way that, say, Tibetans are being forced to give up their language and learn Mandarin. And if the way that the Western media reports on it is China trying to standardize help kids in rural areas learn Mandarin so they can get better jobs.
Well, I think this is touching on what is effective, the whole poverty alleviation thing. That is actually something the Communist Party has been very effective at. You have like Bernie Sanders arguing that, hey, they did lift millions of people out of poverty. That has been an incredibly successful propaganda line.
Another one is the whole, I think Biden mentioned this in the town hall, right? This whole idea about the century of humiliation, and China needs to be strong or else it'll be taken advantage of by, foreign forces. So that's the way that they look at all, like
current problems.
Yeah, foreign policy.
Which is the biggest pet peeve I have about how a lot of people understand China is they just view it as this monolithic thing that has been consistent throughout history, rather than the Communist Party being a horrific break in 5,000 years of Chinese tradition, but then also that history itself being incredibly diverse.
The 5,000 years is also kind of like, it's not untrue, but it's like that's a specific, there's a specific narrative about like 5,000 years of culture, or like, looking at how, who united China, what China meant at different points, who was in charge, it's complicated. Yeah.
Right. And how for none of at least the first 3,000 years, or maybe more than 4,000 years, did China include areas like Tibet or Xinjiang / East Turkestan, right? Those are all new as of like the Yuan dynasty.
Xinjiang literally means new territories. So
Yeah, well, let's just kind of pretend that that's not the case, because it's been part of Chinese territory since ancient times.
Hey, what about New England?
That was part of English territory in ancient times.
Yeah, is it still new?
Actually, when New England was part of England, it's hilarious, like comparing how that's like the latest Chinese dynasty, right? Like when New England was first settled by colonists was like during the time, like that's like one of the earliest parts of American history.
And that's like the beginning of like the Qing
the
dynasty,
1600s.
basically.
Yeah. I mean,
China is old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about New Mexico? Come on. How long is it going to be new? Am I right? Am I right, Alexei?
Very right, Chris.
Tells me just what I want.
So what were we talking about?
I feel like I lost the thread, honestly.
Matt was making some very intelligent points for...
I believe I was.
And then you derailed it by talking about New England and New Mexico?
No, I think I had a legitimate point. Oh, no, I was talking... Well, we were talking about Chinese history. But that reminds me, we were talking about Hong Kong earlier. And this past week, there's been... What's my catchphrase? My unfortunate catchphrase? There's been more arrests in Hong Kong.
The Hong Kong police have arrested more democracy activists.
Well, that might not be a catchphrase for too much longer because they're going to run out of democracy activists.
Well, yeah, at this point,
perfect.
every prominent Hong Kong activist has either been jailed or is in exile.
Also, like these last 47 people that were charged this past week, then like they did things like made them sit through like 4 days of hearings to like of bail hearings and stuff like that.
So they're torturing them too.
Well, and then the court granted bail for 15 people out of the 47. And then the government basically was like, nope, and put all 47 in prison.
Oh, so the bail canceled?
It was like, because the government is going to appeal the ruling. So they're like, well, we're taking everyone back to prison. Yeah, so this is the thing, like under Hong Kong law previous to the national security law being passed, like even if people were arrested for the protests or whatever, they'd basically be released before trial. Like they'd be, released on bail. And then with the start of the arrest of Jimmy Lai, like they just held him.
Yeah.
Like he's such a danger to society.
Yeah, old journalist.
Yeah, so like it's interesting how like even that is another sign of, the just sheer deterioration of what's happening in Hong Kong.
Well, it's also because, and this ties back into the patriotism thing, I believe starting, it's either already started or will start soon, but the 2 sessions in China.
Well, when this was published, it will be the first day.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, it's like the biggest political meeting of the year where, the rubber stamp Congress rubber stamps all the directives the Communist Party wants. And it seems like a lot of it's going to be tied to Hong Kong, demanding patriotism, erasing what little last bits of democracy the city might have had. So, I mean, I think that's probably part of the reason why they weren't allowed bail, because it's syncing up with this very politically sensitive time in China.
Yeah.
And they want to see what the direction is from the party.
Well, like I said, I think on Twitter that, it's 2 sessions season when dissidents start getting arrested and put under house arrest and all this stuff, which happens in Beijing every year around when the 2 sessions start, like 2 weeks before they start, just being like, all right, you guys can't go anywhere. We're going to send people to monitor you. Like, you're under house arrest. And now it's kind of been expanded to Hong Kong.
Hong Kong is another part of China now.
Yeah. And the people who predicted it was going to be more like Xinjiang than, Shanghai. I think they're more on the right track, right?
I mean, we'll have to see. That would still be a pretty big escalation from where it is now.
Well, yeah, but I mean in terms of they weren't going to let Hong Kong become just like another Chinese city like Shanghai, which is not like an open-air prison the way that Xinjiang is. They might not put people into concentration camps in Hong Kong, but another thing that came up in Hong Kong last week was that there's proposed legislation that hasn't been voted on yet, but the proposed legislation
voted.
Yes. By now, LegCo, the legislature in Hong Kong, is also essentially a rubber stamp parliament
Mhm.
because they disqualified a bunch of pro-democracy politicians, and the other pro-democracy people essentially like were forced to resign. There's no opposition anymore in the Hong Kong legislature. So this is probably going to go through. The proposed legislation is that the government could stop people from being able to leave Hong Kong.
Yeah, and with the recent announcement by China that anal COVID tests are mandatory for foreigners, no one's getting in or out.
Thanks, Chris.
That was an intelligent point in my books. Right, Alexei?
Yeah, so to all of our friends in Hong Kong watching this, get out while you still can.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
it's hard to. Where do you go?
I mean, some people can't leave, or some people choose on principle not to leave.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I was talking a few months ago with one of our friends in Hong Kong, and this person told me, I specifically encouraged them or said to them, like, are you leaving now? Or like, when are you going to leave? And they said, I'm not leaving. I have got my work to do here. And I found that to be very courageous, but also terrifying, because I feel like it's just only a matter of time. And a lot of people that we'd interviewed in 2019 are in jail now.
Mm-hmm.
Or in exile.
Yeah. Or in exile. And things are happening so rapid. Like, it's only been 9 months since the national security law. And already they've arrested basically every activist.
There's no pro-democracy legislatures anymore.
You can't even wear your T-shirt with the yellow umbrella on it anymore. Like, it's a completely changed place.
And I think what Shelley said about it being more like on the Xinjiang side of things, like, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there's like a more concerted effort to wipe out Cantonese in Hong Kong. There's already been a lot of that, like a push to like diminish its use in schools, very similar to what was done in Tibet and in Inner Mongolia and now in Xinjiang, in terms of trying to erase the culture of the place. I think we'll see more of that happening in Hong Kong.
Oh gosh, now I'm thinking about that movie 10 Years that we watched
It turned out they didn't need 10 years.
Yeah, right. It's actually like
6. It's been 6 years. So that movie was published in 2015, and we interviewed the director, Andrew Choi, in 2016 during our Pivot to Asia
it was
tour.
like a producer, yeah.
I remember, that interview, and we were just kind of chatting with him afterwards. And like, I was thinking at the time, this is a pretty doom and gloom prediction for just 10 years.
Yeah, because it was basically like four or five different short films. 5. And I like to forget that one
of them was a bit funny.
It was very odd. But like, there were things like people not being allowed to use Cantonese. People like this guy got in trouble in one of the films for having a like stand that sold local eggs because he couldn't use the word local. Remember that one? And then there was another one where
that was one where like the Hong Kong kids had to be part of the Communist Youth League.
Yeah, basically where the kids were, and that's also like patriotic education is going to be implemented.
Oh yeah.
So like it's not that far off in a certain way. Yeah.
Well, and the thing that is very foreboding about all of this is once the Communist Party feels like it's got Hong Kong, it's full steam ahead to Taiwan from there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the reality of the situation is that Taiwan is, in danger,
Yeah.
I think people in America tend to not really believe this because it seems so far-fetched that a country would use military, like a developed country, well, China, like a modern country would use military force to just wantonly take over a democracy. But the Chinese Communist Party has been telling us for years that they are going to conquer Taiwan one way or another. The people in Taiwan fully understand this and they're preparing for it. But like people in the West are like la-di-da-di-da. They're just empty threats.
Well, I feel like in Taiwan, it's not necessarily that simple. I mean, I've read some things about how like Taiwan's military is a little not prepared for this.
Yeah, that they're not keeping up their service. There's a lot to that. And we should maybe make an episode about that. But I mean, yeah, like Taiwan is definitely next. And so I really would like to know what Biden's China policy is.
They recently, I think last week, released an interim national security strategy. Like, it's
Oh,
not
yeah?
the full national security strategy, but it's kind of like a interim summary of like how they see things. And I read the China section, and I'm a little worried.
What did it say? I actually didn't know about this.
Generally similar things to what we've heard Biden administration officials say so far.
Rival, but cooperate.
Like rival, but like not really using stronger language to talk about it. Competitor, rival. Definitely don't want to call them any kind of actual antagonist, right? The strongest will go is competitor or something like that. Used China the whole way through. This is a departure from the Trump administration's national security strategy, where they specifically started calling out the Chinese Communist Party and Trump's national security strategy. And there was also like a specific strategy they released on like how they see China as well, that specifically talked about great power competition. And this is like a flurry of these, like, are we in a new Cold War articles from this kind of stuff, where like the Trump administration was specifically saying the Chinese Communist Party, is like...
The Chinese Communist Party is the biggest threat to America's development.
Well, kind of. Like, I don't think they said it exactly like that, but they were saying things like, we recognized how the Chinese Communist Party sees the relationship between China and the U.S., which is one of great power competition. Like, we're going to treat it like that. So basically, more having their eyes open with like the nature and actions of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Biden administration kind of going back to this like softer, like rivalry, competition. We should cooperate when we can. Like, not that it's like cooperation is another one of those words that gets twisted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because of course, we're taught from children, like, you want to cooperate.
So this is a way to get back to the way that the Communist Party twists language. When we talk about cooperation, we mean, here in the West, we typically mean working together for shared interests and shared goals, right? When the Communist Party talks about cooperation, they mean compliance with the Communist Party's goals.
Cooperation for a mutually beneficial future.
Right. So this
for
whole
mankind.
Win-win mutual cooperation. But what it really means is now you have to cooperate with me on my terms.
Because they're not going to give in.
Because they're not.
Yeah.
We just have to be aware of what that is. And I think the short-sightedness of looking at cooperating with China on issues, well, number one is we say cooperation because we think shared goals and shared interests. What the reality is, we don't have the same goals and interests, and we're just sometimes blind to that. And number two, we've been tricked before. The two best examples of this, I think, are the Bush administration started out sounding tough on China, but after September 11th, they decided they wanted to cooperate with China on the shared interest of fighting terrorism, global terrorism. And the U.S. meant one thing, and what the Communist Party did is use terrorism now as their catchphrase to persecute political enemies, and they're still using it as they go after the Muslims in Xinjiang. They just took this idea of cooperation, twisted it to their own uses, but using the same word to meet their own ends. And it didn't help the U.S. stop terrorism at all. It had zero impact on that. And then after that was the Obama administration, who had this idea that we have to cooperate with China on global warming because it's a global challenge. And the only way is to cooperate with China. And so what has China done on global warming? Number one, we know that ideologically that they don't actually care about reducing carbon emissions because they've been going full steam ahead on building new coal plants. I guess steam is appropriate.
It's very appropriate.
So they said they want to cooperate, but actually not only have they been building coal plants, which are releasing carbon, but also they've been taking advantage of the renewable technology push by stealing U.S. technology for windmills and solar panels. And now most solar panels that you buy in the U.S. are made in China.
They've totally taken over the industry,
And when they're made in China, they're made in these bad working conditions, powered by coal to make the parts, right? It's insane. And yet we thought in the Obama years that, oh, we can cooperate with China on fighting this. The Communist Party does not care about carbon emissions. They don't care about the environment, except maybe as it potentially could lead to protests or other embarrassments. But essentially, they've completely hoodwinked us and taken advantage.
Not to mention the Belt and Road, right? They're building coal plants on all along the Belt and Road.
Oh yeah. No, it's a completely, from the perspective of reducing carbon emissions. Like if you listen to what the Communist Party says, you'd think they want to be a global leader. If you watch what they do, you'd think it's like they're racing to get to the bottom. It's shocking, a shocking contrast.
Really, the Chinese Communist Party entire foreign policy is kind of built upon manipulating U.S. diplomacy. Like if you think about the salami slicing or what they've done in the South China Sea, their whole strategy is like, we'll do the little things that push the envelope just a little bit, so much that not enough that you would really do anything, because then like you don't want to start a war over like some rocks in the ocean. Yeah. Was that Kirk Sullivan or was that Jake Sullivan or Kirk Campbell?
It was Kirk Campbell.
It was Kirk Campbell. Mm-hmm. Good choice, Biden. Yeah, this whole like they understand how diplomacy works. It means you don't want to do anything until you absolutely have to, and by that point, it'll be too late.
It's interesting because it's like I don't think it's just the U.S. It's like how it's been treating like Western democracies in general, or just like it's like they think that no one. It's like they've been so good at doing this that they think that no one's ever going to catch on, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like this whole thing that they do with the whole, we're going to publish one version in English and another version in Chinese.
No one knows how to read Chinese outside of China.
And it's like a few years ago, the Chinese Students and Scholar Associations in the U.S. got caught working with Chinese consulates and embassies because they'd say they were in Chinese on their websites. Or on like their WeChat.
We're proudly working with the Chinese consulate.
Yeah, thank you, Chinese consulate, for funding our whatever program. And then, thinking that like nobody was ever going to get in trouble because who would, and then like Chinese speaking and reading journalists caught onto it. So, I think there's like there's a certain arrogance there to like that they've been able to get away with it all these years. And like, they can just keep on saying good sounding things about win-win mutual cooperation.
Well, it sounds like it's working if the Biden administration is going back, not talking about the Communist Party, talking about China, talking about cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've said before that we should judge their actions, and I still think that's that's the way to go.
But in general, they've said mostly what they should, though I'm not well. Mm-hmm. This national security thing sounds awful.
Yeah, so like that's so it's kind of like, how will this translate into policy? Mm-hmm. That's not clear yet. Like if there's some kind of confrontation over Taiwan, what will happen? Like all of this is still kind of, a little bit like the U.S. has kept on doing freedom of navigation stuff in the South China Sea. They've sent ships through the Taiwan Strait. Like
Biden had the Taiwanese essentially ambassador at his inauguration.
Yeah, so
that was a first.
Yeah, so that it's not like saying that everything's terrible, like we're just giving up and the CCP is going to take over. I don't think that's the case.
Well, I think it's like Matt said earlier. It's like we need to judge by not what they say, but their actions. He was talking about the Chinese Communist Party, but we need to do that with the Biden administration as well.
Yeah, and I think we should encourage them. Not like just the three of us, but like, everyone watching, like it's all of our job to, regardless of whoever's in power, like we have to encourage our officials to do the right thing. And that's the case with the Biden administration. But what I wanted to point out about when the Biden administration broke from, like the Trump administration, particularly Mike Pompeo, kept calling out the Chinese Communist Party, and the Biden administration is going back to calling it China. This is yet another example of how the Communist Party uses language to trick people. Yep. So China is such a broad term, and there's actually not even a clear definition of what China is. And so like when someone says something that is critical of the Chinese Communist Party, they're accused of being anti-China. When something does someone that hurts Chinese people, they say, oh, you're anti-China. But these are actually two different things. right? We're accused of being anti-China, even though we've always stood for the rights and well-being of the people living in China. And so it's correct to call out the Chinese Communist Party because the party controls the government, and the government implements the party's policies, including arresting dissidents, killing people for organs, and so on, right? So ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party is the responsible group. But if you start talking about how we deal with China, then it blurs the lines. So anything that seems like we're standing up to China could sound like it's anti-Chinese people or standing up to Chinese people or against the people in some way. And so people who are using that term, they feel like they have to couch their language because they're like, oh, well, we don't want to seem anti-China. It's very...
You constantly have to make that disclaimer, right?
Well, even the Trump administration was doing that. Like they were saying, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. Chinese Communist Party.
And I think that's because the Communist Party specifically tries to do that kind of conflating them,
See that in Australia all the time.
But like the thing is that, we use this country as a shorthand for the government a lot. Like when we say like the US or whatever, and we actually mean the Biden administration. But it's different when it's a country that has like a democratically elected government versus, a authoritarian regime. And also the Biden administration is not doing things like saying, well, if you're criticizing us, then you're anti-America. That's the part where the Chinese Communist Party comes in and then does this conflation thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Biden administration is not killing Americans for their organs.
That's also true.
But also, what does it mean to be patriotic in America? People have their own ideas of what this means, but for a lot of people, that means speaking out against the things that people in power are doing because you think that's not in the best interest of the country, right? And no one says that a person who is critical of the Biden administration or the Trump administration is unpatriotic for having those views, right? That's just part of being
You haven't been
American.
listening to American political discourse.
Very few people, very few actual average Americans believe that, right? Like patriotism isn't about supporting
a specific
specific party.
Yeah.
Right? It's about the love for the country. And again, a lot of these things are kind of fuzzy and nebulous, and it's hard to put a handle on it. And if you're a clever politician, you can take advantage of language. And the Communist Party has done a great job of that. And just to get, and I'm not saying the Communist Party did this, but it is a win for the Communist Party that the Biden administration is using the word China and not Communist Party. It's a huge win for the Communist Party.
I mean, I'm sure that the Biden administration had their own reason for doing that. I don't think they were like, well, the Chinese Communist Party will be pissed off if we say Chinese Communist Party. I don't think that's why. Probably they thought that, it was McCarthyist or something for the Trump administration to say.
Or just that they had to do something to make their China policy sound different from Trump because it's politically not good for them to be too close to the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think the theme of the Biden administration's foreign policy so far seems to be we're going back to diplomacy. Perhaps it's undiplomatic to call out the authoritarian regime that you want to be diplomatic with.
I don't know. Which president has not done an airstrike in Syria?
Well,
I can't name one recently.
I think Trump did do airstrikes in Syria. That's why.
Yeah. No, I mean, look,
Garfield.
Okay.
the cat or the president?
Both.
Either. Yeah, honestly. Well, the interesting thing here that we don't really know yet is whether the Biden administration going back to this language of talking about China and using the term rival and competitor and not talking about great power competition means that they're just doing this for form, like what you said, Chris, about, they just feel like they have to not have the same policy as the Trump administration, or whether this is what they believe and they don't believe that China is in a great power competition with the U.S. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, whether they honestly think that China's a rival, it's a competitor, but we can work together and it's not trying to destroy us. It doesn't think that we're the biggest threat to it,
And that's really a crucial difference. And it seemed a stretch of the imagination to think that the Biden administration would somehow not understand that, especially after everything that's happened over the past couple of years, as the Chinese Communist Party became a bipartisan issue. You have Chuck Schumer recently talking about, urging a bill to outcompete China.
Well, see, that's a little different because that kind of is like China's our greatest competitor. Like, that's different than a great power competition. That's just thinking like economically, we need to be in a better shape to compete with China.
That's true. But it seems like, well, considering who is in the Biden administration, it would seem like the people would just have to have not been paying attention.
Well,
And considering people like
Right. Well,
Kurt Campbell, well, maybe.
Can I just say that, like, the first year and a half of the Trump administration,
Yeah.
like, he was talking about my friend Xi Jinping. He took that state visit to Beijing where he said something like, China has treated me better than anyone has been treated in history. And like,
I think he meant in the history of China.
in the history of China.
To be fair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Only in the history of China. So only the last 5,000 years. Like, does Trump not understand what a threat the Communist Party is? And I think looking back after 4 years, it's clear that, this is not certain, of course, but I'm thinking that maybe what he was doing was trying to get a trade deal that he thought was going to stop the Communist Party from infringing on the U.S., but he kind of had to play it this way in order to get what he wanted.
I think it was support for North Korea. That was the big thing.
Yeah, and I think your analysis on that is also really,
It's possible.
I think that's
There
an
was
important
that thing
factor.
where Trump said that he thought that China could control North Korea. And then Xi Jinping gave him a history lesson on the relationship between China and Korea.
It's like,
Remember that?
And it was like, South Korea was really a part of China at one point.
And
Trump is like, oh, wow, I never knew that.
yeah, and then like everybody was like, Trump is so ignorant,
Yeah.
But
But the point is, it did take a while for the Trump administration's China policy to kind of solidify
I think
and come out.
I think it was clear from the national security people pretty much from the beginning where like this is a problem, we need to
Yeah.
But then you have the Steve
Mnuchin, yeah.
and like the people who just
The
want
Wall
to
Street
do
bros.
business with China. So like, and then you had people like Peter Navarro who was on the business trade side, but he was very much like
Death by China guy.
yeah. So like, who was going to come out ahead in this? Like,
Yeah. And so it's kind of understandable that, like, all right, it's been like what, a month and a half,
6 weeks, yeah.
6 weeks. All right, the Biden administration's China policy is not crystal clear yet. Of course, that makes sense. I think it's just the Biden administration is kind of operating under this added pressure of there was the whole Hunter Biden scandal. There was the past failures of getting China in the WTO, which Biden supported as a senator, all of his dealings with China as vice president, the work of Kirk Campbell, Jake Sullivan, Eli Ratner, lots of reasons to be very concerned that this could go in a very bad direction.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is that like also they may have a ideological similar to the Obama administration in this like ideological belief in that like honest belief that like different cultures have like different
Cultural norms.
yes, and like I'm not saying that to like rag on Biden because we did this
No,
whole
but look, it's the Communist Party's cultural norm to take over Taiwan. That's just
I mean like I'm just because like there was this whole like brouhaha about genocide being a cultural norm or
right,
whatever,
and that
which
was
is-
way exaggerated.
but like there is a certain strain of thought more towards like the Democratic Party, right? That like you can't have one culture imposing their cultural norms on top of another culture. So this is the idea that like human rights aren't necessarily like universal so much as I mean I don't think that any American president would say that, but like there was this kind of feeling I think in the Obama administration that like we don't want to be the ones to impose our values
systems.
on another country, right? Like it's like the anti-American imperialism idea.
This goes back to what Matt's saying about how China's been very successful with that kind of propaganda. And that could be feeding into this kind of worldview. Where, I mean, yeah, if you say, like, it sounds perfectly reasonable to say, one country should enforce its values on another country. Until it's the Chinese Communist Party. They're killing their own people. They're trying to destroy the world.
Right. I mean, we don't enforce our values on Mexico, right? I mean, Mexico has a lot of different cultural elements than the U.S. The difference with the Chinese Communist Party is we're also not telling them that they have to be like Americans in every respect, right? It's just like, stop killing your own people, stop putting your ethnic minorities in concentration camps. I mean,
Don't invade Taiwan.
Yeah, like
Don't stop it in Hong Kong.
these aren't big asks.
Depends on your perspective.
They strike at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is the stuff that the Communist Party is using to stay in power.
Yeah, so it's not an issue of like, oh, the Communist Party needs to reform. Fundamentally, that's impossible.
Yeah, so I'm a little worried that the Chinese Communist Party is going to pull well, if you want us to cooperate on climate change, climate czar John Kerry, we can accept that. But, you can't really say anything about human rights. Let's talk about it behind closed doors.
Which is what happened big time in the Obama administration. Actually, for most of recent
Clinton,
history.
Bush, Obama.
You can talk about these things to us just behind closed. Don't do it publicly.
It's like Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama. Yeah.
And then not Trump.
So the secret is that if an authoritarian regime tells you not to talk about something in public, the only way to achieve what you want to achieve is to talk about it in public.
So undiplomatic, though.
I know.
Oh, yeah. What that whole diplomacy thing?
I mean, it's not that diplomacy is a bad thing.
It's just you have to understand who are you being diplomatic with. Is it France? In which case, send the nukes. Or Iran?
Yeah.
China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing.
Canada.
Again, going back to are we going to call out the Chinese Communist Party? Because if we don't, we're going to treat them like they're just like a normal country.
That's the issue with the whole genocide designation. Currently, the Biden administration is still reviewing that. I don't know why they need to review it, but it's a Trump
maybe they
policy
just think
thing.
that the Trump administration didn't dot their I's and cross their T's.
Yeah, but if they come out where they go back on
that would be a huge blow to the U.S., I think.
It seems politically impossible to do that. But then
maybe there's a way they could just blame it on Trump and then they could get away with it.
I'm concerned it might go down a route of it's Xi Jinping. The longer telegram kind of thing. It's Xi Jinping, get rid of him, and then the Chinese Communist Party is fine to work with.
I don't think that will happen with the genocide designation. The thing about the reason why Justin Trudeau didn't want to vote on this is because Biden and Trudeau have to directly interact with Xi Jinping, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no way.
You can't treat China like a normal country if you also label it as a regime that's committing genocide.
Yes. So the heads of state have to avoid doing that. So I don't think the Biden administration will directly say Xi Jinping was, genociding people.
Can I suggest that there's another way where you don't have to label as committing genocide the country that you work with, which is to not work with the Communist Party.
But no, we have to work with them on
They're
shared
bonds.
goals.
It's shared goals like fighting climate change and fighting terrorism.
See how well it's worked in the past?
They've got me too.
Well, I think that's the thing. You can't say that you don't want to work with. It's not a Cold War situation right now and I think that's...
Which it is a Cold War situation.
Yeah, but there's an active resistance to that whole idea of great power competition too, that the world doesn't want to be split up into these two. I think this is something that's happening in Europe a lot, the European Union, right? We're now in a post-World War II,
as China is gradually trying to eat it up.
Yeah, but the whole idea is that we don't want to do this thing again where it's half of it's this way, half of it's with the communist bloc, half of it's with the Western bloc. We don't want to go through that again. So we're going to close our eyes and put our fingers in our ears and go la 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 la,
And hey, if Hungary is completely bought off by China, it's not the same as East and West Berlin, right?
Well, I think actually where East Berlin now is going to be Hong Kong, which used to be West Berlin.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, but again, we need to actually see what the Biden administration does. And as we said earlier, it took time for the Trump administration's China policy to crystallize. So it is too early to be flying off into flights of fancy of Biden's going to let China invade Taiwan. Way too soon.
Too early for accusation, but it's the right time for all of us to put pressure on the administration to do the right thing.
Yeah, China has to be the Chinese Communist Party has to be an issue Americans care about. Because those are America's cultural norms, as Biden says. The president has to listen to the people.
And talk about human rights.
And talk about human rights.
And what's a good way, Chris, for people to do that?
To
learn about what's happening in China and what they ought to tell their officials to do.
Well, there's this video game called Dynasty Warriors. It's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but it's just a lot of fun. That's pretty much where I learned about modern China politics.
Okay.
I learned about modern Chinese politics by studying Karl Marx.
I feel like, was that supposed to be a joke? I can't.
No, not really.
Okay.
I mean, if you read Marx, as I have, like, it's pretty clear that that's actually the way that they're doing things.
No, if you read Marx, you get it. It's a joke.
Groucho.
Watch China Uncensored. That's what Matt was giving me the.
Oh yeah, I didn't get what he was hinting at. It was so subtle.
Watch us. We're great.
We're great, and we have lots of jokes that aren't that funny.
Honestly, I think if people are watching this podcast, they're like,
You have to die.
yeah, they're the hardcore.
Die hard.
Yeah,
Not die core.
I said hardcore.
Yeah, I think I was trying to say die core. You are the die core of China Uncensored.
Yeah, I mean, if people will sit through us playing Monopoly Socialism, like these are the true fans, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, stay tuned for when we play Stardew Valley as a curve. That'll be a wild ride. wild ride. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chow.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
See you next time.